Good evening, everyone. My name is Jessica Rockhold, and it's my pleasure tonight to welcome you to what I believe is now the 7th presentation in the Auschwitz Speaker Series, which is a partnership between MCHE and Union Station, Kansas City, in support of the exhibition Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away. We are in a webinar format this evening. So as a participant, you will be able to access the question and answer feature at the bottom of the Zoom window to ask questions of our speaker. After her presentation, we'll be joined by MCHE's historian, Dr. Shelley Klein, who will moderate those questions to our presenter. Before we get to that, though, it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, George Costello, who is the president and CEO of Union Station, Kansas City.
Thank you, Jessica. I can't believe we've already done 7 of these. What an honor it is to be able to partner with the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education to make systemic change in our community. The response to the exhibition and the overwhelming response to the presentations have been heartwarming and very encouraging as we assist Midwest Center to reach its mission in our community. If you measure it by the individuals that have come to the exhibition, we are obviously really reaching a chord in our community. Well over 200,000 tickets have been sold, and we're already sold out all the way through December of this year. So I think we're making a difference. When you look at the numbers of responses that we're getting, we're receiving a net promoter score just shy of 100, which is unheard of. And people are understanding and having a deep understanding and appreciation for what happened during the Holocaust and what your organization and what we are trying to do to make change in our community. I think that's the most important. So without any further ado, I would turn it back to you, and we encourage people to join us in the exhibition, but more importantly, join us for many of the programs.
Thank you, George. When George came to MCHE and explained that this exhibition was coming to Kansas City, he was very clear that it was important that we partner and make sure that there was a great deal of education surrounding this, that this was an exhibition experience, but education as well. And when we viewed the exhibit in New York and we started to think about the important themes to draw out of the narrative, 2 things, about tonight's presenter immediately struck us. One is that we wanted to make sure that we were speaking about all of the victims of the Holocaust, that though this is a centrally Jewish experience, that there were many other people that were caught up in various systems of Nazi persecution and murder, and we wanted to make sure that we were telling all of those stories. The other thing the exhibition does beautifully is talk about how the Holocaust is an evolution of policy, that it is not a murder operation from the beginning, and that it goes through a series of radicalizations globally as an entire structure, specifically at Auschwitz. And so as we were discussing those themes, we thought of a friend that had been in Kansas City before and had presented so beautifully. So it's my pleasure tonight to introduce you to Dr. Beth Greek-Polelli, who is the Kurt Mayer Chair of Holocaust Studies at Pacific Lutheran University. She's been in Kansas City before and spoke specifically on this theme of disabled Germans and their experience in the Holocaust. But she's written very broadly. She's covered topics ranging from anti-Semitism, memory, the Nuremberg trials, the experience of Bishop von Galen. So she is a very diverse, a diverse scholar, and we're very excited to have her back with us this evening. So Beth, it's my pleasure to turn it over to you.
Great. Well, my thanks go out to everyone who's been so kind, Shelley Klein, and to Jessica Rockford, to invite me back. I had such a positive, wonderful experience when I came out just a few years ago. It seems like because of COVID that it was such a long time ago. But I can't thank you enough for having me out here. And I'm going to try to share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see the screen as it shows the Nazi Euthanasia project. And I think I want to leap right in because I know we only have so much time and I'd like to take questions. And I know that Dr. Klein will be monitoring the Q&A, so she will be looking for your questions at the end of my presentation. As Jessica Rockford just mentioned, there's all kinds of victims when we talk about the Nazi regime. And I think for most people, the first victim group that their mind automatically goes to, and justifiably so, would be Jewish people. And what we're going to look at tonight, this so-called euthanasia project of the Nazi regime, is really an exploration of how some of the technology and some of the messaging that the Nazi regime puts forward is going to be first directed at a very specific group of people, most notably mentally and physically disabled children and adults. And we're going to see how that technology, how that propaganda, how those policies feed into and facilitate the persecution and the annihilation of the Jews of Europe. And so for my first part of the presentation, oh, let's just see if I can get this to go forward for us. Sorry about that. Okay, there we go. You'll see your first image that you're going to see here is Nazi propaganda against hereditarily ill people. And there are literally so many examples of Nazi propaganda targeting what they would have called hereditarily ill people at this time. I just pulled out this one, but my goodness, if you went on Google Images and typed in Nazi propaganda against the disabled, you would certainly find your fair share of this. In Nazi Germany, when Hitler became the leader of Germany in January of 1933, he was strongly supported, particularly by a group of individuals who called themselves Race and Hygiene, which was part of a eugenics movement. And for those of you who are not really familiar with eugenics, this is a movement that really grew out of social Darwinist thinking. And of course, at the root of social Darwinist thinking is the idea that there are certain groups of people who are of more value, who are more superior to other people. And the Nazi regime totally and fully embraced this idea of eugenics. And of course, I think we all know that the Nazis promulgated the idea that the Aryan, the Germanic Aryan peoples were the supposedly most valuable of races. And then there's a kind of racial ranking, a hierarchy of people. In Hitler's kind of propaganda and his language that he used, he told the German Aryan people that he was there to unify them into what he called the Volksgemeinschaft. And I realize that's a super long German word, but it translates into just simply the people's community. And part of this idea of the people's community was that as people were brought together into this community, there were by definition going to be people who were excluded from that people's community. And particularly for tonight, our focus is on a group of people that fall into a general category that the Nazis called asocial, or they sometimes called them social outsiders. These are people that are pushed to the margins of the German community. And according to the eugenics theories of the day, these would be people who were supposedly of less value to the general society. Inside of the eugenics debate, there's all kinds of discussions about better breeding, how to improve the human race, how to improve the Aryan race, how to strengthen it. And so they approached eugenics from both what they called a positive eugenics as well as a negative eugenics. And here I'll refer to this image that I have on the screen. If you look at the one side, this is supposed to be a person who has a hereditary disease. And the wording above the man's head says, it costs 5.5 Reichsmarks from the state to take care of this particular person on a daily basis. And then they contrast that with what they would consider to be the valuable members of the Volksgemeinschaft, of the people's community. And that, of course, it says, but for that same amount of money, for the 5.5 Reichsmarks per day, a hereditarily healthy family can survive for 1 day, right? And there you see that intact family of a husband, a wife. They've got 3 children. The children are dressed appropriately. The little boy has what looks to be like a stack of books under his arms. And this is all kind of part and parcel of this eugenics movement that not just in Nazi Germany, but even prior to Nazi Germany, really from the late 1800s on, social Darwinist thinking, the eugenics movement had really gripped many in the medical and scientific community, and it had kind of trickled down into the general population. What we find in this eugenics movement and in Nazi Germany is not only is there this propaganda put forward that there are hereditarily ill people and the state is using taxpayer money to keep them alive, to keep them going, whereas this healthy Aryan family doesn't get that type of assistance from the state. We could look and see that there's also the connection being made in Nazi Germany that being mentally disabled is also in line with criminality. And this becomes kind of fused together in much of Nazi propaganda. Being a criminal, being mentally disabled, in some capacity, they're seen as, in many respects, crimes against the German state, against the German people. And here we can see, again, another propaganda image that you can see this kind of idealized, healthy-looking Aryan man, and he's bearing the burden of caring for what was often called, in very unflattering language, the undesirables, right? And so we see these depictions of the criminal and the mentally disabled, where the mentally disabled person doesn't even look fully human. And so this is the type of imagery that is going to really assault the German people throughout the time period, even before Hitler becomes the leader of Germany, but most definitely once Hitler is the leader and totally embraces the concepts of the eugenics movement and social Darwinism. He embraces this so much that one of the leaders of the eugenics movement, a man named Fritz Lenz, just absolutely lauds when Hitler is appointed the Chancellor of Germany in 1933. And he says that Hitler, he really understands that the mission of politics is race hygiene, right? And so they really, racial scientists and others get on board immediately with the Nazi regime. For the Nazi regime, they find it critical to work with these so-called race scientists because it gives this air of authority, right? That here are scientists, there are doctors, these very educated people, and here is what they have to say. On top of that, I'll throw in here, just to keep in the back of your mind, that as early as 1920, so long before, years before Hitler is appointed the leader of Germany, 2 men, one man a lawyer, the other man a psychiatrist, got together and they co-authored a book. And in this book, they advocated for the destruction of disabled people. And they argued their point by saying that disabled people were spending lives what they called unworthy of living. And so they were seen as contributing no value to German society. And the thought was, you would be doing these disabled people a favor if you destroyed them, if you ended their lives. And so all of these ideas, that the book written by the lawyer and psychiatrist that are arguing this kind of radical solution that you should get rid of the disabled, combined with the authority figures in these eugenics movements, are all going to kind of coalesce together in the Nazi regime. By 1934, Hitler will declare 1934 as the year that German people have, quote, the duty to be healthy. So we can again see this kind of pressure being put on people saying, if you are healthy, then you are for Adolf Hitler, you're for the Nazi Party, you're working for the greater good of the Volksgemeinschaft. But if you are ill in some capacity, then you are basically a traitor and you do not get to be included in that people's community. All right, well, this kind of sets the background of the rest of the talk. As I mentioned earlier, the eugenicists had two different approaches. One was what they called positive eugenics, and the other is negative eugenics. With positive eugenics, and here I just pulled this very stylized image. It's from the Race and Politics Bureau. And this is part of a calendar that they distributed in 1938, and it's the new people, the new folk. And here we can really see in kind of stark and colorful images that the Nazis had this ideal image of the Aryan, right? Who should be encouraged to continue to reproduce. And so we see the perfect, ideal, well-muscled man staring, fearlessly off into the distance. We see the idealized, beautiful, perfected woman. And of course, at her breast is a child, showing that they're healthy, they're reproducing. And part of this idea behind positive eugenics was, of course, the Nazis want to target what they think of as the ideal Aryans and encourage them to have as many children as possible to build up the genetic strength of the Aryan people. In contrast to that, in contrast to that, we have negative eugenics. And that is, here on this slide, we can see that Nazi Party policy is that they say we're going to bring about a rebirth, a regeneration of the Aryan people. And we're going to do that through eradication. And what does that mean? Well, in many of their metaphorical language, they would say, we are going to prune the population. We're going to, just like you would prune a rose bush, right? Where you would cut the blossoms off that have already bloomed and are starting to wither. You cut those off, you prune it back in order to bring forth a much healthier rose bush by the next growing season. This is exactly the type of policies that they're going to be putting into effect with regard to human beings. And so within the first 6 months of Hitler being named Chancellor of Germany, on July 14th, 1933, a law is announced. Now, this law will not go into effect until the 1st of January, 1934. But on July 14th, 1933, the law is announced. It is usually kind of shortened by historians just calling it the Sterilization Law. But I gave it on the slide here, the full title, Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring. And I will note that the Nazis were masters of euphemistic language. They tended to use language that would try to obscure and obfuscate the real intent, what it was that they were trying to do. So if you saw Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring, maybe that means the government is going to have prenatal healthcare programs so that women, when they find out they're pregnant, get the best medical care and the best vitamins to ensure that the child developing in their womb is going to be as healthy and strong as possible. But of course, that would be the rosiest of interpretations. What this law really stipulates is that there are certain categories of those social outsiders, of those asocial people, that need to be, in the Nazi mindset, they need to be sterilized so that they cannot pass on whatever disease they have been labeled with having. And you can see on your slide there that it included people who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, people who had been treated for manic depression, for epilepsy. You can see if you were born blind, if you were born deaf. And then we get into a kind of more nebulous area of severe physical deformity. But then the question is, who gets to decide what qualifies as severe? We have severe alcoholism. Again, who decides what makes a person a severe alcoholic? And then my favorite is the final one, congenital feeble-mindedness. And in fact, when we talk about congenital feeble-mindedness, this comes to be the largest category of victims of this law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. And in fact, the vast majority of victims of this category of congenital feeble-mindedness will be women. And I will give you some concrete examples in just a moment of how this all plays out. All right, so I said that the law was stipulated, was announced on July 14th, 1933, but it doesn't really go into effect until January of 1934. And so what do the Nazis do in this gap of time between July 33 and January 34? Well, what they begin to do is they begin to establish a large bureaucracy. And the Nazis are pretty much infamous for having this large bureaucracy, bureaucratic state. And this large bureaucracy that they're creating creates a parallel court system. So they look at the pre-existing German legal system, and in this 6-month or so time period, they create what's called the hereditary health court system. And so this is separate from the regular German legal court system. And these hereditary health courts have a panel that will serve as the judges. The panels typically, most generally speaking, were of 3 people. They would generally be 2 physicians and 1 lawyer. And they would serve as kind of the 3-man, and it was always men that served in these panels, the 3-man panel of determining what was going to happen. All right, so how does this whole process then play out? Well, in this interim time period between July and January, the Nazi regime puts out the information that doctors, nurses, social workers, school teachers, and just in general, any person can recommend, if they know that there is someone who should be investigated and be prohibited from reproducing, then they should submit those names for consideration to the hereditary health court system. And immediately when the court system convenes on the 1st of January, 1934, they have been inundated with denunciations. And this was actually quite shocking to many of the people involved in setting up this bureaucracy. I think they believed that they thought it was going to take a little bit more work to get names submitted. And to give you a feel for how vast this population embraced the denunciation of their neighbors, in a 2-year time period between 1934 and 1936, over 259,000 victims were denounced to these hereditary health courts. Out of those 200 and some thousand, I would tell you that the hereditary health court system saw and heard over 225,000 of those cases. Of those 225,000 cases that they heard, 90% of their victims were then destined to be forcibly, involuntarily sterilized. So it was pretty much a foregone conclusion that if you received a letter of notification on such and such a date, you are to appear before the hereditary health court for potential sterilization. You can bring witnesses. You can bring, mostly men were allowed to testify. Again, this is part of Nazi kind of eugenics thought that women were like children, and therefore their testimony wouldn't carry as much weight. But essentially the idea was that you could assemble some individuals, men who could come and speak in your defense, but you would appear before these two doctors and a lawyer. And if you fell into that category of having been diagnosed with, say, schizophrenia, if someone had denounced you for congenital feeble-mindedness, you had a very poor chance of walking out of that hereditary health court hearing and not receiving notification that you would have to later report to a clinic in order to be sterilized. And so here, let me kind of stop and just give you at least some real examples of what happened. I'll give you just one example of that 10%. One of those lucky individuals who was denounced. In this case, it was of a man who had been denounced because he was deaf. He was brought before the hereditary health court, and he had assembled school teachers, male school teachers, who had taught him as a young person. And they could testify in this man's defense, and they could say, when I taught him in my class as a young person, his hearing was fine. He was not deaf. And ultimately what came out of this trial was that this man had lost his hearing fighting for Germany in the First World War. And because of all of the sounds of the explosions, that had damaged his hearing and he had become deaf. And so he's one of the so-called kind of success stories that historians can point to. In the end, the hereditary health court said, okay, you were not born deaf. You've proved that you were not born deaf, and therefore you do not have to report for sterilization. But as I said, this is one of the very rare examples that we can find. 90% of the people who appear in front of a hereditary health court do not get that notification that says you don't need to be sterilized. And so I want to give you another real concrete example. And this is of a young woman. She had had a formal education up through 8th grade. And then at the end of 8th grade, she left formal education entirely. And although we live in a society where it's just expected you're going to definitely graduate from high school, and then you're definitely going to go to college, and then maybe you're going to go on to graduate school, and so on and so forth. Again, for this time period, there were plenty of people who stopped their formal training at the 8th grade level. She was a house cleaner, right? So she would go in, she was hired by people to clean their homes. Someone denounced her as being feeble-minded. She received the notification that she was to show up in front of the hereditary health court, and that only men could serve as a witness. So she brought her father with her. At the hearing, her father defended his daughter, and he said, I know my daughter is not particularly smart, but she's a good person. She knows the difference between right and wrong. She's never done anything against her employers. She's never stolen from them. She's always been very respectful. And her biggest dream is to someday be a wife and a mother. Please don't take that dream away from her. Well, the 3-man panel says, well, what we're going to do is we're going to give your daughter a test. And if she can pass the test, then she will not have to be sterilized, right? So that sounds like a kind of scientific way to go about it. Well, they give her a test that was designed for someone who was a university graduate. And so it's already kind of baked into this process that she is going to be found to be feeble-minded. She cannot pass a test designed for someone who's attended and graduated from a university, because she's only had up to an 8th grade education. And so she fails that test, and then she receives the verdict that she has to report in at a later date to a clinic to be sterilized, thus ending her dream of going forward in life as a wife and a mother. And this happens quite frequently, to the point that historians estimate that approximately 320,000 German people will be involuntarily sterilized according to this Nazi law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. Now, as part and parcel of what the Nazis are doing, not only do we have this in kind of enforcing the laws and the hereditary health courts going, but immediately the Nazi regime understands that people are going to try to outwit them. They're going to try to evade being sterilized. And so on the slide here, if you look further down, you'll see that amendments to that original 1933 law are quickly added. One of the first things that physicians who perform the sterilizations note is that in many cases, for young women that have received notification that they have to report for sterilization, in the intervening time period, these young women have gone out, engaged in sexual relations in an attempt to become pregnant. And then they would show up on their sterilization date at that clinic and say, well, you can't sterilize me because I'm pregnant. And so the Nazis add in now that if a woman shows up to that sterilization appointment and is pregnant, the doctor should perform an abortion and then sterilize her all at the same procedure. And so these types of amendments are going to be continuously added on to make it exceedingly difficult for people to, again, evade what the Nazis want to achieve. That's from 1933 to 1934, but by 1935, we also have the Nazis putting forward another eugenic step, and this is called the Marriage Health Law of 1935. The Marriage Health Law of 1935 now says that for any couple that is currently planning to be married, they now, before they can go forward with the marriage, they need to go and be examined at a health clinic by a public health official, and that public health official will determine if their union can go forward. And so that's kind of a fancier way of saying that a doctor is going to examine both the male and female members of this engaged couple, and they are going to determine if they got married, would they have healthy children, at least to the best of their ability. They're going to look at family history, and they're going to look at a physical examination and a mental examination of those two people. Ultimately, what that determines and how that plays out in real life is that for some people, they might be in love, but they're never going to be legally allowed to get married. And again, I'll give you just a quick real life example. This has to do with a young woman whose name was Maria. She's in love. She's got a fiance. They can't wait to get married. And they know it's 1935. They have to go to a physician that's been approved as a public health official. And it turns out that Maria's family physician, who's treated her family for years, is a public health official. He's certified. So they go, and of course, the doctor talks to her fiance. He examines him, and he declares the young man, he is physically fit, mentally fit. He is able to get married. However, when he gets to Maria, even though Maria is healthy, the doctor is the family's doctor, and he knows that Maria had a brother who was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And so the doctor refuses to certify Maria as being physically and mentally fit for marriage and reproduction. in the end, the doctor says to Maria, who is crying, and he will not sign the certificate that would allow them to go forward and get married. He gives her the advice. He says, let your fiance go so that he can fall in love with a healthy, fit Aryan woman, and that they can have children together. And so this is all part and parcel of this idea of really interfering and intervening in the most private, most intimate details of people's lives. The Nazis are not going to stop there, though, right? Because although they're preventing people from getting married, although they are sterilizing people so that they cannot reproduce, the Nazis have much larger dreams in store. And so we're going to see that as we creep closer to the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, that the Nazis are escalating their eugenics program. And so they want to move from just sterilization and prohibiting marriages to what they will call euthanasia. Again, this is a gross misuse of the terminology. Euthanasia comes from the Greek words meaning the good death, and it was meant to imply that someone is suffering from a terminal illness, and with that terminal illness, that person makes the decision of their own accord that they would prefer to commit suicide before they're incapable of ending their own lives. That is not at all what the Nazi euthanasia project is. But again, as I mentioned earlier, the Nazis are masters of manipulative, euphemistic language. All right, so how does this all kind of begin? Well, historians point to a letter that Hitler receives. It's thought to be in the late autumn, maybe late summer, that Hitler receives a letter from a man named Nauer. In Nauer's letter, he describes very vividly to Hitler. He says, my wife just gave birth to a boy, but he's been born missing one arm. He's missing a leg. He's thought to be severely mentally, in the words of the day, retarded. We don't use those words any longer, but that's what the letter says. He's possibly blind as well. And Nauer, the father of this child, asks the leader of Germany, can we have permission to have the child euthanized, put down? Well, Hitler gathers his team of top physicians, and Hitler himself had a whole team of physicians. If people know a lot about Hitler's personal life, right? And they gather around, they read this letter, and Hitler dispatches this team of top doctors around him. He says, you go to where Nauer's family lives, examine the infant, and if the child fits the description that the father has painted in this picture, then you should do as the father wishes. So Hitler is sanctioning them to murder this defenseless infant because of Herr Nauer's letter. Now, right there, as a historian, what I would encourage you to think about is that the evolution in people's value system, right? That by 1939, Nazi propaganda has been at least so successful that it has struck a chord with Mr. Nauer, where Mr. Nauer is now willing to entertain the idea of having his own child murdered by the state because he thinks that this is a life, quote, unworthy of living, and that he's going to be putting the child out of the child's misery. All right, ultimately, this kind of conversation around the physically and mentally disabled, this is going to increase, so much so that one of Hitler's physicians, his private physician, Dr. Theo Morell, really by most accounts, a kind of a quack doctor, but Morell is whispering in Hitler's ear, and he is telling him, look, you know, I think that most families who've got severely disabled children, I think those parents would secretly be relieved if the state took those children away, and then they wouldn't be a burden to the family, and the family's resources could be spent on their healthy children, and not in paying clinics and asylums and hospitals and caregivers to take care of those children. And this idea of these so-called mercy deaths might not be so objectionable to parents, as long as the parents were left out of the conversation, that they could keep a clear conscience. And so really immediately following on the heels of these two developments of Nauer's letter about his son and Morell talking about, well, parents might really be relieved if these children just happen to die, we get the establishment of what comes to be called the Children's Euthanasia Program. All right, so for this Children's Euthanasia Program, immediately in August of 1939, questionnaires are sent out to all hospitals to register all what are called deformed or questionable births, right? So the hospital are supposed to give an accounting of how many healthy babies were born, what deformities, if any, did children that were born in your hospital have, what other problems might be coming up. And as this information, as this data is being collected, clinics, about 30 or so clinics all across Germany are being set aside for the so-called care, in quotations, of these children that are mentally or physically handicapped or disabled in some way. Immediately, as these children are targeted, the process basically says, all right, if these children are so severely disabled, mentally, physically, or both, that their parents can't take care of them in their own home, they've had to hospitalize them, what do? Well, we're going to approach the parents and we're going to tell the parents, hey, there are these new clinics that have opened and they're doing kind of cutting edge care, cutting edge technology, and your child, we think, would benefit from being taken out of this hospital that you've put them in and transferred to one of these outstandingly new clinics, right? And your child will get the best care possible. Now, of course, they're lying to the parents, right? Because there isn't going to be any care given to those children. But most of those parents sign a form, right? Because who doesn't want the best for their child? And they say, well, this clinic might be far away from where you live, so you're not going to be able to visit your child on a regular basis. Again, this is all part of this child's euthanasia program, is to move, if at all possible, to move the children as far away from their parents as possible so that parents cannot monitor what is happening directly with eyes on their own children. All right, the children are taken from their original care facility that their family had entrusted them to. They're transported to one of those 30 or so designated children's wards, these clinics. And there are two different methods of the destruction, the murder of these children. The preferred method is starvation. And so in most of these clinics, these defenseless children, who are typically very young, are slowly starved to death. Their rations are cut back to the point where they succumb, they die. But of course, what the Nazi regime immediately recognizes is that this is pretty difficult for psychologically for the actual killers, particularly for the nurses that have to spend the most amount of time with these patients on these wards. That means on a daily basis, they're walking through, they're hearing children moaning, crying, begging for a sip of water, too weak to even raise themselves up out of their bed. And so they begin looking, there might be another way of murdering these children. And the other way is on the slide here, and that is by lethal injections. This would be overdoses that would be designed just with one shot to kill that child immediately. On the slide here, I have that at least 5,000 children were murdered either through starvation or by lethal injection. I would say that now more current research, particularly by an outstanding scholar, a man by the name of Paul Wendling, suggests that that is a very, very low estimation, and that we're talking upwards of 10,000 or more children being targeted for destruction. I will tell you that there are tours given of these wards, usually to other physicians, so that they can see the work that's being carried out, and different facilities. One particular doctor, a man named Fahnenmüller, was very proud of his so-called natural death that he was giving the children. And this was, of course, through starvation. And in one particular tour, Fahnenmüller was very proud as he walked a group of doctors through his facility. He was so proud of how he was starving these disabled children. He grabbed one child by the child's ankles and held the child up as if he were holding, the man describing this encounter was a doctor, and he said he held it up like he was holding a dead rabbit. And he shook the child by its ankles and by his ankles and said, in a day or two, this one will be gone as well, right? And so this was kind of the harshness of this child's euthanasia project. And this child's euthanasia project will never be ended until the Nazi regime is finally defeated in World War II in 1945. So it is an ongoing project. Here we have a slide of some of those euthanasia personnel, right? These are some of the doctors, the so-called scientists who believe in this mission. They believe that what they are doing is a positive good for all of German society. Hitler often brutally refers to the disabled as what he calls useless eaters. They're eating food that he thinks should be designated to sustain healthy Aryans, not to sustain individuals who they believe are not worthy of keeping alive. And so these are some of the individuals who are involved in starving children to death or ordering nurses. And typically nurses were the ones who had to give the lethal injections. These are some of the photographs of the children who were murdered in the child's euthanasia project. Before the children were starved and murdered, pictures were taken. This was part of the process to confirm the identity and to make sure that all the paperwork matched up. And as I mentioned, Paul Wendling just a few moments ago, he has undertaken a study to try to match each victim's name with their photograph. And so that's a kind of ongoing project. And as you can imagine, it's quite a daunting task. Well, while this child's euthanasia project was underway, the Nazis decided to expand their efforts, and this morphs into the adult euthanasia project. Hitler authorizes this project, again, in the late summer, early autumn of 1939. We know that ultimately he signs a document that says on his own private stationery that this adult euthanasia program is going forward. The program itself is going to be considered separate from the child's euthanasia project. And they have done a kind of fairly straightforward mathematical calculation. They've decided that for the 70 million or so German people living in Germany by 1939, they say, well, there's probably about 1,000 people in our population who need particularly psychiatric care. And of those 1,000, they then say probably 10 of them are serious and severe cases. 5 of those 10 probably need to be hospitalized in a clinic, in a sanitarium, in an asylum. And then ultimately they say, out of those 5 that are hospitalized, 1 out of every 5 should be done away with. And so the target number that they're going to shoot for is they want to eliminate at least 70,000 adults who are mentally and physically disabled. And so this all kind of swings into action. The bureaucracy is located, it's headquartered in Berlin. And you can see on the slide, it's located on a street. Strasse just means street. It's on Tiergartenstrasse number 4. And so for historians, when we go through documents, the Nazis use coded language. But whenever you see the initials T4, this means Tiergartenstrasse number 4. And so it's sometimes called the T4 project. Other times it's called Action T4. Immediately, this bureaucracy says, okay, we've got the authorization. We're going to target, we're going to eliminate at least 70,000 adults who are mentally and physically disabled. But how are we going to do this, right? How is the process going to play out? The recruitment begins, right? Who are going to be the doctors, the nurses, the technicians, and then who are going to be the common workers, right? Who will be the janitorial staff, so on and so forth. And I will tell you that the bureaucrats at T4 headquarters are amazed at how easy they can find willing participants. And these doctors, nurses, technicians, and common workers, not all of them are officially members of the Nazi Party, but all of them, when they are interviewed for their job position, they receive clear-cut directions and explanations as to what their job, what their task is going to be, and they can either take it or leave it. And they take it, right? They find willing workers. And this is partly because, particularly for the medical field, many doctors and nurses have bought into the eugenics argument that the population needs to be so-called pruned. Next, they then have to say, okay, how are we going to go about finding the 70,000, in our minds, victims? In their minds, they would not be considered victims, right? How are we going to get rid of these disabled adults? And they design a questionnaire. The questionnaires are sent to every care facility, old age homes, asylums, sanitariums, hospitals, clinics, you name it. Packets of questionnaires go out, and the directors of these institutions are instructed. You are to take a questionnaire and fill it out for every single individual in your care, in your facility. After you've completed and covered all of the patients at your institution, bundle these filled out questionnaires, put them in the envelope, and mail them back to Tiergartenstrasse number 4 in Berlin. And there's no real explanation, right, about what's the next step in this process. And so there are plenty of directors of hospitals and old age homes who begin filling out these questionnaires. There are going to be others that say, wait a minute, I don't know if I want to fill out this questionnaire. When the questionnaires come back to Berlin, to the T4 headquarters, they are then kind of farmed out, if you will. These questionnaires are then sent in bulk quantities to local area physicians. And those doctors receive these questionnaires and they're paid by the piece. And so again, I would ask you to just think about that. The doctors who are reviewing these questionnaires, they're never going to lay eyes on the potential victims, right, whose life hangs in the balance when they're going through these questionnaires. They're never going to see them. The only information they have is what has been filled out on that questionnaire. They don't have the rest of the patient's files with them. And the doctors are encouraged to go through the questionnaires quickly, right? They're paid by the piece. That means that the more paperwork you get through, the more money you make. And there are really despicable, kind of heartbreaking accounts that you can read of doctors, writing a note to their wives saying, oh, I got through X number of questionnaires, and then I had a great lunch, and then I went back and I just went through as quickly as I could. So they're not really going through these questionnaires the way we would at least hope they would, right? With a fine-tooth comb, trying to find reasons to keep these people out of the T4 program. In the end, doctors are told on the front page of the questionnaire, you should either mark a plus or a minus. If they put a plus sign on that patient's chart, on that patient's questionnaire, that means that patient is now going to be on a list to be taken out of their care facility and be murdered. All right, now, so they've got a process, right? They've got the questionnaires, they've got the doctors lined up to go through the questionnaires, but of course they have to also decide on how are we actually going to murder these adults. The child's program is already running. The children are being either starved to death or receiving lethal injections and overdoses. But the question is for adults. First of all, they're targeting at least 70,000 adults for murder. That's a fairly large number of people to murder. And then they say, you know, if it's an adult, the adult might have the capability to fight back. They might fight to try to get rations. They might not just lay in a bed as a 2-year-old toddler might. Right? And so they have to think of a new way. How are we going to murder these victims? And eventually the answer is found. And the answer is there's a new kind of technology called the gas chamber. And that might be a solution for a multitude of problems that the Nazi regime is facing. The first problem is, how are we going to kill adults in an efficient manner? Large numbers of them in an efficient manner. And the second problem is the psychological burden on the killers, right? When those nurses inject a child with a lethal injection, if the nurse wanted to, the nurse could keep track of how many children did I murder today. And so the Nazi regime, they're always concerned about the psychological ramifications for the killers. Of course, they could care less about the psychological suffering endured by their victims. The first gassing of victims is an experiment. It happened either in late December or early January of 39-40. 8 men are taken, disabled men are taken from a nearby facility, and they are transported to an abandoned, what had been an abandoned prison in Brandenburg. So this is just kind of outside of Berlin. And one of the basement rooms in the prison has been hermetically sealed, and a door with a viewing window has been installed. And all 8 men are lied to. They're told that they're going to be having a shower. And if you're very familiar with ultimately gas chambers and the Holocaust, as I'm sure that many of you are, then you would know that this is really setting the format that will be used in what will come to be called the final solution of the Jewish question. Those 8 men are told, you're going into a shower. The room is designed to look like a shower. And ultimately, a chemist injects carbon monoxide through a pipe into the room that these 8 men are sealed up in. Ultimately, the experiment is deemed a success. All 8 men have died inside this gas chamber. The doctor, one of the lead doctors that was present there at the time, reports into Hitler how smoothly this went. Hitler then authorizes gas to be used as the killing agent. And once this experimental killing has taken place and all the visiting dignitaries have witnessed it, Hitler has sanctioned it, we get the creation of 6 killing centers spread all across Germany. And their locations, their names are listed here on the slide for you. Ultimately, as I said, the objective is to murder at least 70,000 adults. This is one of the killing centers. These are the nurses at Hadamar, and they eventually, some of them will be placed on trial for what they did during these projects. This is an image of victims on their way to die. They would be transported in these kind of gray buses. You can see that the men in the white coats are checking the paperwork to make sure that the victims are in the ones that are on their list. They're driven to these killing facilities. And ultimately, with these killing facilities, the victims are told, you're here to get showered up, and then we're going to get you new clothing, and we're going to take care of you. But if you really looked around any of those killing centers, there is no space. There's no beds. There's no hospital wards, because none of those victims are staying there. They only have really within hours left to live. Ultimately, the Nazi regime, as this next slide shows, and here I have to be mindful of the time, but what we find is that the Nazi regime wants to keep this adult euthanasia program and the child euthanasia program as secret as they possibly can. At the same time, they want to sell the idea of euthanasia being acceptable to the German public. And so you can see that they give tours of asylums. The goal of a tour guide in one of these asylums is to take their visitors past the worst case scenario, people inside these care facilities. And at the end, if you're lucky as a tour guide, one of the visitors will raise their hand and say, why are these things even kept alive? Right? And so the idea behind this, of course, is you have dehumanized the disabled to such a point that the person on that tour does not even recognize them as human beings. SS officers were required to participate in tours of mental institutions, again, to drive home this point that you should not feel empathy or sorrow. There's all kinds of propaganda posters, there's radio programming, there's magazines, there are even mathematical word problems for children to solve about how many people in a mental institution and how many criminals in a jail do you need to get rid of in order to feed healthy families. And then there are films, right? A nice, very convenient way. These are just some movie stills. I won't talk about them. I can answer questions about them later. There are always people who denounce and who risk their lives to speak out against this euthanasia project. Pictured here on this slide is the man I wrote my dissertation and my first book about. His name is Bishop Clemens August Graf von Galen. He was probably the most famous person in August of 1941 to deliver a stinging sermon against the euthanasia project. But there were many others. You can see the name Fritz Bodelschwing. He directed a care facility for epileptics. And ultimately, he worked with Bishop Clemens August Graf von Galen by smuggling a blank questionnaire to the bishop so that he could see the types of questions. Von Galen gave a sermon where he said to all those people in that church on August 3rd of 1941, you do not need a law that it is wrong to murder. It is wrong to kill. He says that is engraved on the human heart. You should just instinctively know that. And then he went on to talk about how there were concrete examples of people living in his area of Germany, an area called Munster, where individuals had been taken up into this euthanasia program. And von Galen tried to drive home the point to everyone in that church. At some point in all of our lives, we might fall into a category of a useless eater, of life unworthy of living. And do you want the state to have the power to determine that you are no longer valuable and that they can do away with you? Ultimately, that famous denunciation of von Galen temporarily halts the Euthanasia project. It brought a lot of public attention that the Nazi regime did not want. But by this point in 1941, the Soviet Union has been invaded. We have the mobile killing squads going into Eastern territories. And there's already a search. How can we kill large segments of the population in a very efficient manner? And the gas chambers have already been test piloted in this euthanasia project. And so the same doctors, nurses, and technicians are then transferred further east out of Germany to oversee the construction of gassing facilities and crematoria in the major killing centers: Auschwitz, Majdanek, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, and Chelmno. The last thing that I'll talk about here, and then we'll open it up for questions, are the lessons. And I think this is probably the most important part. First of all, I think we can see that the technology that was developed in this adult euthanasia program is critically important to understanding the Holocaust, or the final solution to the Jewish question, right? That the Nazis are experimenting with the gas chamber technology and cremation by killing the mentally and physically disabled. And then this will then be broadened out to how can we eliminate the Jews? How can we eliminate the Sinti and the Roma, and so on and so forth? And so historians have the very fancy terminology that the euthanasia program was the technological prefiguration of the final solution, right? And so it gave that technology. This method also allowed the people involved in the killing a degree of deniability, right? I only undressed them. No, I only escorted them into the room. I didn't put carbon monoxide in. And then of course, later in Auschwitz, you get the development of Zyklon B, but it allowed a kind of alleviation of the conscience for the actual killers. But I would say the most important lesson that Hitler derived from this euthanasia project was that even though individuals like Bishop von Galen did denounce the program, there was never any kind of mass protest against what the state was doing. And Hitler really learned from that. If German people would not rise up and take to the streets to protest the murder of people they professed to love, their children, their siblings, their grandparents, their parents, if you would not protest that, then are you really going to take to the streets to protest social outcasts and pariahs like the Jews? Probably not. And so if they begin to be deported, if they begin to disappear, more than likely, people will not question it. And I think I better stop there so we can have time for some good questions. And I thank you very much for your patience, for hanging in there.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I always learn so much from the discussion of this topic from you. So I thank you for that. We have a number of good questions. I think maybe the first place to start, we've had a couple ask about the relationship between eugenics in Germany and other places in the world at the time or before, particularly in the US. Could you just speak a little bit about that connection?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I'll preface it first by saying I'm a German historian and not an American historian. But of course, from doing research on von Galen and doing research about the euthanasia project, of course, you do find out, oh my goodness, this is rather shocking. And what I can tell you is that in the United States, in the 1920s into the early 30s, at least 24 states had sanctioned forced sterilization. They stopped short of euthanasia, but they did sanction forced sterilization of particularly mentally ill and mentally disabled people. And so this was definitely part, and so the Nazi regime is not creating anything new. This is something, the eugenics movement, as I said, grew out of social Darwinist thinking. And so it was prevalent in British society, in American society. And in fact, there's a short but very interesting book by a man named James Q. Whitman. And he's a scholar, I believe, at Harvard University, a legal scholar. But he talks about how in Germany, the Germans were looking to America and were shocked at how far the American legal system was willing to go in the field of eugenics. And that the Germans felt like they were running behind the Americans, right? That they had to catch up in order to so-called cleanse their Volksgemeinschaft, to cleanse their population. I live right now in Washington State, and I've learned over the years from giving these presentations that in Washington State, they, up until really the 1980s, in many prisons, sterilized female inmates involuntarily. So again, we can't just say, oh, this is just a German thing. Unfortunately, eugenics was a widespread, popularly accepted and believed in movement. And because it had the aura of science, many people felt this isn't any type of discrimination, this is science. And science says these people are less valuable, and we're doing them a favor by putting them out of their misery.
Part of your answer reminded me of another question we have, and one that certainly interests me. You mentioned the sterilization in prison, and I know that continued here in the U.S., especially among female populations. Could you speak about the gendered aspect of this in Germany, and in terms of were women disproportionately affected when it came to forced sterilizations?
Yes, that's the shortest answer I can get. Yes, they certainly were. And really the largest category out of that 320-some thousand German people who were involuntarily sterilized, the largest segment are females designated as so-called feeble-minded. And as I gave kind of the example of the girl that had the 8th grade education, this was really stacked against women, right? That when they were brought in, and you could be brought in because you had too many boyfriends, right? A neighbor says, oh, she runs around too much, I don't like that. And then they would say, you're feeble-minded. And the test that they would give you was designed so that it was built-in failure. But it would look like it was scientific and objective, right? No, we gave you a test and it's not our fault you failed the test. So yes, women are disproportionately impacted particularly by the sterilization laws. I'm not as clear for the adult euthanasia program about gender, so I can't quite speak to that, but most definitely in sterilization, it is women.
One thing I think that is surprising to a lot of people is to know that denunciations played such a large role in finding who was going to be targeted. Do we know any more about that process? And were these people who were calling out their neighbors and friends, were they doing so because they believed ideologically in what they were doing? Or do we have any evidence that they were motivated for some other self-interested reasons?
Well, I think I've become kind of cynical over the years, Shelley, so I might not be the best person to answer that. I'm thinking of work by Robert Gelately and the Gestapo, right? And he investigated how the Gestapo received all types of anonymous denunciations, and it was often family members wanting to settle scores, right? It was a mother-in-law who hated her son-in-law, and so she would denounce him to the Gestapo, the anti-Hitler, right? Now, sometimes she meant it just as kind of a scare tactic, right? But other times she just wanted him gone, right? She didn't like him. I think we could probably find a mixture of motivations regarding reporting people to the hereditary health courts for sterilization. And so honestly, I can't think of a work right now that I could rattle off and say, here, they've studied, the motivations of people. But I would say human nature being what it is, my best educated guess would be, for some people, they are hardcore eugenics Nazis. They believe that, yeah, that family has a kid, that kid is slow. I don't want that kid ever reproducing and dragging the German people down. It's brutal, but that's how many people felt. And then there are, of course, other people that, just want to settle a score with somebody, and that they don't really care what the ideology is or what the implications are. They just want to terrorize that person that they want to settle the score with. So it's very disheartening, to say the least. I mean, again, I think there were all kinds of magazines and radio programs aimed at specifically women, encouraging women to think of that if you denounce your neighbor, you are actually more womanly for denouncing them, because you're a caregiver, you're a nurturer. And as a nurturer, you're nurturing the health of German society. And so it's your job as a woman to really be on your guard, and you look for any kind of troubling indications among your friends, among your neighbors, even in your extended family, because that's how you demonstrate as an Aryan woman that you are guaranteeing the health of the Aryan population.
Yeah, it's a fascinating sort of part of this, how that figures out there. Do you, given that there's so, like you just mentioned, there's all this encouragement towards people, there's films, there's magazines. So what do we make of how public this was? And then how does the actual, when does the full story really come out to both people in Germany and then the world?
Okay, well, when von Galen gives his sermon in August of 1941, denouncing what the Nazi regime is doing, the British Psychological Warfare Division picks up the speech, and they translate excerpts of the speech into every major European language, and they leaflet it from airplanes all over Europe, right, to alert people. This is what the Nazi regime is doing to its own people, right? They're rounding up people who are defenseless and they're murdering them. And so in that sense, it becomes kind of public knowledge, right? But of course, at that point, then Hitler says, okay, we're going to get even with von Galen once we win the war. We'll take care of that later. But for right now, we need the Catholic German population on our side, so we can't make him a martyr. So in a way, you could say, well, some of this becomes public knowledge really after this sermon. But even prior to that, children sang songs about hide when you see the gray bus, right? The buses were always gray that were taking adults to be euthanized. They were painted, they were postal buses, the postal delivery buses that were painted over gray. And if little kids are singing songs about run and hide so the bus doesn't take you away, at that point, it's really what I would call a public secret, right? If little kids know and are singing about it, people are talking, right? They're spreading rumors and so forth. And of course, the Nazi regime tries to ignore, tamp down the reality of it, and they try to put out these kind of glossy Hollywood movies that, it's a young, beautiful woman who's got a terminal illness and she wants to die to free her husband to go marry a healthy, but that's not what the euthanasia program really was, right? It was taking people against their will and murdering them. None of those victims ever said, please put me out of my misery, right? Help me commit suicide. They were not ever given any option. They were simply taken away. So the Nazi regime is constantly trying to combat the spread of knowledge with lies. There are also plenty of people whose family members have been murdered, and they begin to say, well, now, wait a minute. They sent me a form letter, and it said that, my mom died of pneumonia, but I had just been to visit my mother 2 days ago, and she didn't have any symptoms of pneumonia. So how can she be dead, right? And then there are the letters that say, your son died of a burst appendix. We rushed him to surgery. We tried to save him, but we couldn't, right? And then they realized, but his appendix was removed, 2 years ago. and your appendix doesn't grow back, right? So the Nazis are very sloppy in their notification letters. They're basically form letters, and there's certain kind of illnesses, pneumonia, a heart attack, appendix burst. They're kind of form letters that get sent. And there are people who begin to say, well, now that doesn't make any sense to me, right? So there is an undercurrent. But unfortunately, by this point in time, by 1941, the war is raging, right? And in 1941, the Nazis are still winning the war. And so most German people, I think, are too intimidated to say, I think the government is killing our own people, right? And so very, very limited acts of resistance and protest happen then.
And finally, could you speak to what happens to some of these doctors and nurses that participated in these actions?
I had a slide here, 2 slides for that, but I figured I better cut it short. That's an excellent question. We want to kind of at least give people, some degree of closure for this. Beginning in 1946 through 47, during the Nuremberg war crimes trials, there was a doctor's trial, and this was conducted really through the United States supervision, right? So US officials were supervising this trial. In the end, there were fairly harsh sentences. There were 3 doctors that were sentenced to death by hanging. Many of the orderlies that worked in these facilities received 30 to 35 years in prison, but others escaped all justice. Some of them committed suicide at the end of the war, and so they were never arrested, they're never brought on trial. But many of them went back to private practices, right? As if they had never been involved in any of this. A second trial opened up specifically for the Hadamar staff. So if you were watching the slides and you saw the nursing staff in front of Hadamar facility, that began in February 47. 25 of the staff from Hadamar were put on trial, but this time it was under German supervision, and only very light sentences were handed out. Because again, the argument was they were only following orders, and therefore they can't really be held totally accountable. Since that time, in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, there have been also subsequent trials, but for the most part, there really is a feeling of a lack of justice that's been carried out, right? Because some of these doctors and nurses just returned back to their pre-Nazi life, and not a peep was said about what they had done, and they just continued on as if they had never been a part of these projects.
I think the project of post-war justice on all accounts covering the Holocaust is one that is incomplete and frustrating and missed the mark on almost every occasion. So
yes,
thank you again.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure. I love talking about, it's a terrible, awful topic, but I'm so happy to share with your audience, and I'm just thrilled to be a part of the discussion. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And if all of you who are with us, please join us again tomorrow at 2 p.m. We'll have another Zoom panel, including Dr. Greek Palelli and also Gerhard Baumgartner, who some of you have maybe seen previously, and William Sperlin. And the 3 of them will discuss, again, the Hitler's first victims, the Roma victims, and then queer victims of the Holocaust. So that is our panel on non-Jewish victims of the Holocaust. That's tomorrow at 2 p.m. Via Zoom. And then on September 23rd, I will be speaking down at Union Station. I believe it is our first in-person lecture of our lecture series, and that is at 6:30 at Union Station. So we encourage everyone to attend both tomorrow and then on the 23rd. So thank you again for speaking to us. Thank you for staying with us, everyone. And thanks again to our partners at Union Station. Have a good night.